Today on Radio Free History, we move forward into the 1920s for episode 7 of our How Art Got Ugly series. The 1920s is the pivotal decade in our story. To understand the 1920s is in many ways to understand just why the world is the way that it is. Something so important certainly warrants a deep dive. So usually we start each one of these episodes with us roasting modern art, Beavis and Butthead style. This is going to be a slightly longer episode, but we're not going to leave you hanging. We're going to at least give you one or two horrible pieces of modern art, and this one was in the newspaper a couple of days ago.
This looks like an upsetting male appendage.
It's supposed to be a foot covered in tongues. And worst of all, you see that woman on the left with her foot on that pink thing over there. When she pushes down on the pedal, water comes out of this. Because the one thing better than a penis covered in sores is a penis covered in sores that secretes.
Yeah, this is not good art. This is something that I think future generations will look back on and be like, oh, when they're trying to figure out how the decline happened.
Well, that's actually apropos of this episode, because we're going to be looking at the 1920s, which is a pivotal decade, not just in terms of the arts, but in terms of our culture in general. You'd actually be surprised how many of the things we take for granted come out of the 1920s. But one of the horrible ideas that comes out of the 1920s that nobody's asked for, and quite frankly didn't even have a good reason in the first place, is the concept of the art installation. Yeah. And that's what gave us this wonderful thing in New York's High Line.
Yeah, it's a deeply upsetting thing. I've seen a lot of really, really weird art installations. I had to work as a famous festival in Toronto called Nuit Blanche. And at one point I was guarding an area that was being renovated. So it was just a construction site, and people were coming up and asking me what kind of art installation this was. And I was bored, so I told them that it was an empty work site meant to make them reflect about the effect automation was having on the working classes. And they took pictures, and they were, I never had anyone doubt that construction site was an art installation. So, that's a low bar to clear.
So this is episode 7 of our How Art Got Ugly series, and up until now it's been a lot of foundational material. Today we start to actually answer that question directly. We're not going to finish it today, but it's no longer just going to be background material. Now we actually get to answering it. And that kind of shit that you're describing about having theories about the emptiness of society or automation or industrialization, all that stuff, that's going to actually come out of what we're talking about today.
Wow.
So,
one of my professors in first year said, "You are thinking the thoughts of dead men." And I laughed at him, and now I'm getting creeped out.
Yeah, we're not as in charge of our thoughts as we would like to be.
Nope.
It's ridiculous the number of things we've been propagandized to think, and we think we thought ourselves into.
Well, I was shocked, just researching for the World War II episode, is just how much Soviet propaganda had influenced my view of Russian technology and Russian weaponry. Yep. It blew my mind how much of what I thought I knew came out of Soviet propaganda in the post-war period.
And if you think Soviet propaganda has warped you, wait till you find out how much American propaganda has warped you.
Woo!
At least we know that Soviet propaganda is propaganda. That's the thing.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like the American propaganda or the Western propaganda. It's just the ocean we swim in. It's just the water.
Yep. So I'll give one more piece of art before jumping into the episode. The World Cup of Soccer is going to be jointly hosted by Canada, the United States, and Mexico in 2026, and all of the cities with venues published posters a couple of months ago. And here is the Toronto poster.
No, that looks like something speaking of Eastern Europe. Jesus.
Well, we're now sophisticated enough art historians that we can kind of see what's going on here. I'm sure the guy who designed this poster thought he was just being an absolute genius doing this, or at least he expected to be able to convince us he was a genius. Now that we've spent the last few episodes looking at early 20th century art, we see exactly what this is. This is just a cubist and a futurist painting. If you didn't see our previous episodes, cubism is where you smash something up into a bunch of pieces and then paste the pieces on the same surface, and futurism is where, at least the early futurist paintings were supposed to show motion lines and all that stuff. So this guy is trying to convince us that he's coming up with some new visionary version of avant-garde art for the this upcoming event next year. He's just going back into the toolkit from 115 years ago and trying to act like we're Philistines for not knowing what he's doing. If you don't believe me, here's an example. This is Metzinger's Two Nudes. We looked at this a couple episodes ago.
I can definitely see the influence.
Yeah.
Homie went to art school, whoever
Well,
painted
that's
it.
exactly it. Like, when I say that our culture has been on an auto loop for the last 100 years, this is exactly what I mean by it. In the year 1912, this is even before World War One. Before World War One, this was completely played out. It was maybe, new and interesting for a couple of years, but before the Archduke was shot, everybody was getting tired of this stuff. And now somebody's trying to come across as an avant-garde artist doing something new and different, and he's just going back into his art textbooks and basically cribbing the idea.
Yep.
So that's Cubism, this is Futurism, same thing. You can still see the influence here.
Yeah, I could see this looks like Adult Swim.
Yeah, exactly. A YouTube channel I follow referred to Adult Swim as Millennial Dada, which I think is a perfect way of describing it. And Dada is another thing that has just been on an auto loop for the last 100 years.
And that makes me feel much better for watching that. I feel very validated for my love of Aqua Teen Hunger Force.
I don't know if you should feel validated, but if anybody wants to look down on you for watching Adult Swim, you can give them a pretentious art word saying, "Oh, this is just the modern Dada."
Yeah, I now have defenses. Yeah. I got my Patriot system in place now against these weirdos who went to art school.
Yeah. Again, if you don't remember, a couple of episodes ago we talked about futurism, which is where it shows a bunch of different time frames all superimposed on the same picture. So you see some fat Italian woman laughing on the left. You see somebody talking with his hands on the right. I don't know. Whatever this is, like it, hate it, I don't care. My point is that it was completely played out by the year about 1912. And it's the year 2025, and people are still trying to do this stuff and pass it off as I'm an original artsy-fartsy person.
Yeah. Watch, they probably were talking to Clockwork Elves and stuff. Yeah.
So, here we jump into the episode. Now, we're talking about the 1920s today. There are a lot of video games and movies that employ the narrative technique of parallel storylines, often set in different time periods. Like, that's almost a trope from the late 90s, early 2000s. And there's also the overdone and usually very poorly done multiverse idea, where every parallel universe has a different aesthetic. Like, half the Marvel movies do that at this point.
Yeah, they gotta keep bringing dead characters back.
Yeah. Well, and the thing is, each universe could look like literally anything, and yet they always seem to embody just a certain style of cinema from the last 100 years.
I had to watch Spider-Man Into the Multiverse, and it was just horrifying.
Yeah.
It was just...
Well, but that's the thing about the multiverse, though. Like, if you're looking at a place where different laws of physics could exist, why does it just look like New York, only slightly different? Everybody's slightly race swapped.
Yep, little race swap, little power swap, little off to the next multiverse. I guess because I grew up with Sliders being like a trash TV show.
Yeah, there's another example. Yeah, if you look at any of these multiverse or parallel universe pieces of media, just one of the ongoing tropes was always the mechanical age. Like, one of the parallel storylines is very often a world that almost has the steampunk aesthetic, like this.
Yep.
Like, this is the movie Hugo from the early 2010s on the top left. On the top right, that's a video game called Siberia.
Could be the Will Smith.
Oh, the Wild Wild West?
Wild
West.
Yeah.
That is another perfect example, the big mechanical spiders.
Oh, the steampunk spider.
Yeah, that's BioShock Infinite on the bottom left, which was set in the year 1912, and for those of you who are aging millennials like we are, that's the game Myst in the bottom right, probably the original game to introduce the mechanical era, at least as far as video games go. It's an old trope in movies.
And people take this very seriously. I'd see people when I was working security at cons or like nerd events. People will come dressed up with this aesthetic.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's both the steampunk aesthetic that came from a little bit earlier, and then there was the diesel punk aesthetic, which was like Indiana Jones age. But that all comes from this general time period that is sometimes known as the mechanical era. Just when we look at this aesthetic, whether it's whimsical and fantastical, you know, with the flying islands like the one on the bottom left, it's actually not really floating islands, it's mechanically flying islands. Or you think about the aesthetic with the gigantic gears, you know, they're just beating you over the head with this idea that this is some world that our ancestors lived through that we don't live through anymore. The mechanical era, it's not just some random amalgamation of shit from the Industrial Revolution, from Charles Dickens to the atomic bomb. It's very much... This is very much a 1920s aesthetic. We just don't kind of realize it's a 1920s aesthetic.
Yeah, I never would have put this in the 1920s. I always thought this came out of nerd culture or something. But it's fascinating to learn that.
Yeah, I guess a bit of the 1910s as well. There's a little bit of pre-World War I stuff, but this is very intentionally a 1920s aesthetic. The mechanical age, it's funny because it doesn't refer to maybe the 1850s, which is when the Bessemer process came out, mass-producing steel, which completely changed the game even by the standards of the Industrial Revolution. It also doesn't really refer to the 1880s when people had the fascination with trains and railroads. Like, the only piece of media I can think of there is Back to the Future 3.
Now I don't have to marry my cousin.
Or his mother.
Or my mother.
Yeah, the mechanical age, the mechanical era, this general trope, it represents a time when there's a sentimental attachment to the mechanized, industrialized world. It's not just that there's a bunch of factories in the background, it's that, you know, the humans in the mechanized world, they're just finally starting to make peace with each other. I think that's the general idea I get when I look at any of these pictures with the big gears or the electric lights or anything else.
Yeah. A kind of mechanical utopia kind of situation. Right?
Yeah, well, yeah, utopia is a good word. I mean, just the iron bars and the concrete slabs. I mean, now you think of that stuff, you almost just think of being stuck in a cubicle. But back in the 20s, the iron bars and the concrete slabs, they were supposed to represent the dawn of a utopian future that everybody's looking forward to.
By the time we came up, you know, I'm thinking about the Borg.
Yeah, there's another perfect example.
TNG, where you see how that image had turned into this. Now it's a dystopian hellscape instead of this, you know, utopian paradise.
Yep, but the utopian version is not just something abstract, it's an amalgamation of a bunch of time periods. The point I'm trying to get across is this is just a 1920s and to a lesser extent 1910s aesthetic.
Okay.
Just in the same way that the poodle skirt, you associate that with the 1950s, this look is a 1920s aesthetic.
And in every city, you can find a group of people dressing like this to this day. And it will come into popularity and it will go out of popularity, but it will always be there. It's just woven into our culture.
You know you're getting old when the stuff from your childhood starts becoming the nostalgia stuff. I'm starting to see like cargo pants and the pixie girl look coming back.
Yeah, mullets.
Wow. I haven't seen a mullet yet, but I'm sure I will now that you mentioned that, and I'll cringe when I do.
The only reason people need cargo shorts are the same reason Charlie Sheen always wore cargo shorts. And if they're coming back into vogue, that's, you know, we got to have a talk with our young people about the dangers of drug abuse.
When we say stay positive, we do not mean like Charlie Sheen.
No. Make sure there's no tiger blood on you.
So, we're going to be calling back to a lot of our previous episodes, really for the first time here. I try to keep these episodes self-contained, but like I said, we're 7 episodes in, and at some point we need to call back to things we've already talked about. In the second episode, we talked about the scene in the movie Ferris Bueller's Day Off, where the characters go to a modern art gallery at the Art Institute of Chicago. And we asked, just why is it that every piece of art that they showed was by an artist that got famous between about the 1870s and the 1920s, give or take the occasional Jackson Pollock piece?
Yeah, it's very strange.
Yeah, I mean, well, that scene has been credited with instilling some sort of art appreciation in Gen X and the older millennials. Maybe not the younger millennials, but the pre-Harry Potter millennials.
We had wordsmiths like Andrew Dice Clay and Howard Stern before.
Even Donald Trump was an icon back then, before he's Donald Trump now. That's a different story.
Yeah, Howard Stern was saying such horrible things on the radio that they would like ban his broadcast in Canada.
Somebody referred to Howard Stern as the only person who went from being red pill to being blue pill.
Yeah, apparently the big cough really scared him.
Yeah.
Because he's always been a germaphobe. And that really got him into a different way of thinking. So it happens to we live long enough, we become, our enemies. What can you do?
Mm-hmm. So the works that Ferris and Cameron looked at in that movie, they went back as far as the Impressionists, who we talked about in the third episode. But it really focused heavily on the post-Impressionists, people like Van Gogh, Cézanne, Gauguin, and Seurat doing the pointless picture that Ferris's friend was staring at, thinking that my daddy doesn't love me because this is just like this kid doesn't have a face, just points.
Homie with the freaking pixels.
Yep. Yeah, so that's what the majority of the art in that scene was, but there was also some really weird stuff since the turn of the century, like the Fauvists, the Cubists, the Futurists, and the Expressionists, and we went over that stuff in the 5th episode. So like I said, we're calling back to everything here. Now, Tom Wolfe, he was kind of like Hunter S. Thompson. He was born in the 1930s, so he was silent generation, but he was spiritually a boomer. He certainly took part in all of the excesses of the boomers, particularly those involving narcotics. But I think his age gap gave him just enough distance to see the absurdities behind the things that the boomers took as truth. Tom Wolfe, he made a career out of making fun of modern America, especially the boomers in polite society. And he wrote a book called The Painted Word on modern art post-World War II, which is going to be heavily referenced in the upcoming episodes, but we're not quite there yet. But in one of the first chapters of that book, he makes an offhand comment about how we just associate this strange modern art with the 1920s. And he just says it, like I said, he says it very matter-of-factly. So at some point, it was common knowledge that all the weird art was associated with the 1920s, the way that we view like the Beatles as 1960s music.
Yeah, it's the smoking gun, as they might say.
Well, in the book, he explains it quite clearly. He says that World War I created this weird time lag because all of the weird stuff from before the war started becoming popular after the war. So this includes art going back as far as the Impressionists. And it only took me 12 hours to do so, but that puts this question to rest. We can finally answer the Ferris Bueller question and ask why that particular art collection exists and seems to kind of work coherently in that scene. It's just nothing more and nothing less than a collection of the art that was genuinely popular for a few years in the 1920s. That's all it was. So that Ferris Bueller scene would be the equivalent of going to a museum that calls itself the Museum of Cinema, but when you get there, it only displays the weird and stylized films of like Quentin Tarantino and Harvey Weinstein.
Yeah, that would seem to be.
Yeah, look, I love the offbeat weird cinema from the late 90s and early 2000s, but it would be more appropriate to call that the Museum of Turn of the Millennium Indie Film than the Museum of Cinema. So it decodes a lot of things when you realize that the Ferris Bueller Museum, the Art Institute of Chicago, would be more aptly named the 1920s Art Institute of Chicago.
Never would have thought.
I wouldn't have known it when we started this series either, but that's part of what research is. They say if you knew what the hell you were doing, it wouldn't be research.
I just want to thank you for all your dedicated research you put into this project.
Yeah,
it really made me want to up my own research.
I just want to get to the bottom of why the fuck a banana is duct taped to a wall and somebody's paying $6 million for it. I just want an answer to that question.
A homie is going through primary documents. So
Yep.
he is like doing the really unsexy history things. that you
Not
have to do.
only that, we live in the age of ChatGPT where I can actually take these weird, German communist documents, say, what the hell does this thing say? Oh, these people are nuts. Yeah, there's a lot that goes into this episode. There's a reason it's been 2 months since the last episode came out.
We're trying to do it well. Sometimes that means we can't do it quick.
I'm just trying to answer the question. I'm trying to answer the question in the most straightforward way possible, and sometimes that means 18 hours.
We're not going to cheat you, the viewer.
So, what is it about the 1920s? Why is that decade so special for art? Well, it's not just special for art. If you read any older literary anthologies or works of criticism, they also talk about the 1920s like it's the turning point. If you take a university English class, the serious literature almost seems to end with Hemingway and Fitzgerald, T.S. Eliot, Ezra Pound, Hart Crane, Marcel Proust, Faulkner, and James Joyce.
Yep.
You get a few writers like Steinbeck after that who make it into the canon, but for the most part, serious literature means literature up to and including the 1920s. And if you read any older literary anthologies or these works of criticism, they absolutely talk about the 20s like it's a turning point. But why? There's just something weird about this one decade where art and literature from the 20s is culturally important at the time, recognized by the intelligentsia at the time, but after the 1920s, just nothing seems to stick the same way. You do get the occasional Jackson Pollock or Andy Warhol in the decades that follow, but as far as art appreciation goes, even that stuff's dead by about the 1970s.
Yeah.
Pablo Picasso, the icon of modern art, he did all of his pioneering Cubist work by about 1911. He got famous after the war. He became a celebrity in the 20s. But he lived until 1972, which isn't that long ago. And he spent the rest of his life just being a parody of himself. Other than Guernica, which he did during the Spanish Civil War, he never really made another culturally significant painting. It was just, hey, Pablo, can you draw another woman, only this time slightly more anatomically incorrect?
Homie peaked early.
Yes, he did. Well, not just 20 years early. Like I said, he died in 1972. He peaked before 1911.
Wow.
It's 60 years of just, hey, Pablo, can you play your greatest hits again?
Talk about milking it.
Yep. So if you read books from the 50s when that time period was in living memory, you don't just see that people talk about the 20s this way, you also see that people very much contrast the 1920s and the 1930s.
Okay.
The 20s were this era of all this strange art, of Picasso and of Hemingway and of James Joyce. The 30s were the complete opposite. They were a decade of this really conservative aesthetic of American Gothic and Hugo Boss uniforms for very different reasons. Just as a contrast, here's art from the 20s. This is Soldiers Playing Cards by Fernand Léger, where soldiers are almost replaced by not just robots, not just automatons, but like tubes from a factory.
Yeah, they look like fucking Cyberman out of Doctor Who.
Yep. He is a cubist, like we mentioned what cubism was earlier. Cubism's where you almost smash things into a bunch of pieces and then glue the pieces back on the plane of the canvas. Léger was sometimes referred to as the tubist because he wasn't just a cubist, he did things with mechanical tubes and the factory aesthetic.
Oh, I bet there were other reasons
Yeah.
that he was called the tubist. You gotta give some to get some in the art world, my friends.
I've read through a lot of primary documents. I haven't read through those, and I really don't care to.
That's for the viewer. You can go beyond that.
This exercise is left to the reader, as they say in the textbook.
Yeah.
So let's look at a representative painting from the 1930s. Completely the opposite.
Wow, this is Norman Rockwell.
Yeah, well, it's Norman Rockwell-esque. It wasn't by Rockwell, but this is called Esso by a guy named Bars Miller, because you can't read it. There's actually an Esso station right in the middle of it. This is a general art style called regionalism, which, at least in the United States, was meant to display Americana.
Okay.
Um,
Kind of that veneration of small town
yep.
life, kind of.
Yep.
Okay.
And it wasn't just this. You also had stuff like Art Deco, which was meant to convey luxury. So already this 1930s narrative of misery and the Great Depression, it just doesn't tell the whole story.
Well, if you kept your job, your buying power actually went up
Yep.
during the Great Depression. So,
And if you were poor going into the Great Depression, you just didn't care. The Great Depression was only for the middle class.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, again, you mentioned Norman Rockwell. That's actually a pretty good example because Rockwell worked for decades, but if Rockwell was associated with one decade's aesthetics, it was the 1930s.
okay.
When you read mid-century books looking back on this period, it's almost like the movie Boogie Nights, where there are two contrasting decades with very different moods and very different aesthetics. And without spoiling too much about the movie Boogie Nights, there's even one character in the story of art who commits suicide in the year 1930, almost marking a transition between the two decades.
Sorry, algorithm.
Yeah.
Sorry.
He unalives himself. I don't know.
Fuck you know, whatever the kids are saying these days. He's not.
We're doing this as a hobby, and actually, if you really want to support us, if you really want us to say edgy shit, drop us a donation, like and subscribe. Go to ko-fi.com/Radio Free History or subscribestar.com/radio-free-history. If you subscribe to our higher tiers, we do have some very nice merch to send out, but really just anything you can do to help us out just makes it a lot easier to research and put the work into this stuff.
And this is still small tube, so I read every comment. I try and respond to every comment. So if you want to say something nice and make my day, or if you want to hurt my feelings really badly, I'm saying this is the place to do it, guys. Come on.
Engagement helps us with the algorithm, so please call us gay if you want to.
I've been called worse. 15 years as a doorman, you're going to get very, very numb to criticism.
So, my point about the 20s and 30s is that there's some real 1984 shit going on, because all we hear is that the 1920s were the last stand of capitalism, the stock market crashed, ushering in the 1930s, which was an absolute decade of misery, but it was made bearable because Franklin Roosevelt swept in to save the day with the New Deal, and then World War II happened, and history starts for real.
And World War II had to happen because it's the one thing that pulled us out of this awful depression.
Yeah, that's not history. That's just a story. And more importantly, talking about economics at a 10-year granularity, that's not history. That doesn't tell you how people felt. That doesn't tell you the mood of anything. It doesn't tell you anything about the culture of the 1920s and 1930s. We need to open up this propaganda black box and look inside, and that's what this and the next few episodes are going to be. The 1920s are so pivotal that it's not just going to be one episode looking at it, but when the whole How Art Got Ugly storyline is finished, these next couple of episodes are going to be the most pivotal part of the story. But I'll give you another example of this 1984 stuff. Think about pop music. There is a smooth transition musically from jazz in the 20s and 30s to like swing music in the 30s and 40s to 50s rock and roll like Buddy Holly and Little Richard. The only difference between swing and rock and roll is there's a backbeat.
Shout out to ska fans.
Yep. Yeah, that's going to be a very narrow Venn diagram between people interested in art history and ska, but we'll see. I'm sure there's a few of you out there.
There's one guy in Ireland. He's going to appreciate that.
Yeah, so you go from Buddy Holly and Little Richard to 60s rock, which is like the Beatles and the Rolling Stones. So there's a smooth transition musically from the 20s to the 60s. And yet, culturally, there almost seems to be a hard break between the 40s and 50s. You will occasionally still hear Buddy Holly as the ambient music at the supermarket, but you never hear Glenn Miller in the swing bands, and there's not that much difference musically between the two of them. You know, even if your friend has a 50s music collection and plays Buddy Holly once in a while, you might call him an old soul, but, you know, we're millennials, we're white guys, we all went through a classic rock phase.
Yeah.
If your friend has a 40s music collection and plays Glenn Miller and Cab Calloway and the Andrews Sisters,
Well, he's on the spectrum.
he's on the spectrum, or at least he's verging into hipster territory, right along with the handlebar mustache and the burlesque show.
Yeah.
So that's just what the next couple of episodes are going to be about. We need to get our mind around the 20s and the 30s, especially the 20s. Because the 20s are just as crucial to our cultural milieu as the 60s, and I would argue even more so. Beatles music just seems dated, but the artistic ideas of the 20s are still around today, as evidenced by that soccer poster that I started with.
Yep.
Nothing ever replaced them. Like in the late 90s and the early 2000s, there was this huge wave of stylized artistic films coming out of Hollywood. Arguably the last wave of true creativity before everything became a Marvel movie with a diverse cast.
But they focus groups so well, Ben.
I'm not pretending that the good cinema from the 90s had a wide audience. The audience was me, but I don't care. If you wanted to make friends with other misfits in urban settings, you talked about this cinema.
I'm just glad that no one's talking about Tibet, because the Chinese box office is just very, very important to Hollywood right now. So,
Yeah, that destroyed Richard Gere's career.
sorry, Tibet.
When you look at those creative indie movies from the late 90s, they all seem to lean heavily on ideas that were in the zeitgeist of the year about 1925. And I'll give you some examples. Pulp Fiction was notable for its nonlinear storytelling, but that was certainly a staple of literature in the 20s.
Yep.
Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, Vanilla Sky, these movies are very clearly surrealism.
Yeah, that's good. Now that you mention
The Fifth Element, that's futurism.
it. Yeah.
The Truman Show, that's about the torture of being trapped in an overly comfortable technological society, which was the theme of Eugene O'Neill's plays. And the final scene is a very clear, the final scene was a very clear homage to this painting by René Magritte, who was a surrealist painter.
Wow, so it's just these same tropes, just repackaged for film, basically.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. It's not even that these same tropes were repackaged. I don't think these tropes ever left.
Yeah, still floating around.
I think that surrealism was the avant-garde in the late 20s, and society just never went anywhere after it. So surrealism is still kind of part of the zeitgeist.
Might call it societal residue.
Yeah. Or you might just say society just has stopped.
Yep. Like a bad Star Trek episode, speaking of futurism.
Well, and again, I'm not even taking sides in that argument. I leave it up to you to decide whether this stuff just resonated with us or whether society just stopped moving. It's an open question. We were talking about Dada. Shows like Robot Chicken or Family Guy with the random cuts between gags, those are clear examples of Dadaism.
I feel very validated. I spent my 20s watching shows like that, and now you see, it wasn't, because I was a complete idiot. It's because I recognized how smart that was.
And I'm sure the marijuana helped you realize the deep meaning in Robot Chicken. Help me with it.
I think my affiliation with the Rastafarian movement will be a topic of the later podcast. I just want to say one love to all the brothers.
Now, some people say that This Is Spinal Tap was the most original film of the last 50 years because it invented the mockumentary, but even that word mockumentary sounds very Dadaist. Like, you also had movies like Magnolia, which were both Dada and surrealism at the same time, with the cuts between scenes and the frogs falling from the sky at the end of it. The creatives of the 1920s, they were doing something new and different, and I'm sure that they thought going forward something else was going to come along and change the art world. Another art movement was going to come along and replace them, but it just never did. The best we had was this creative wave in the 90s where talented screenwriters were milking these 70-year-old art forms, but they weren't doing anything different. They were just making highbrow references to look smart and being respected by people who had a liberal arts degree.
So that's why there's now a fourth wave of ska. It's just like that. You get these tropes that just get every couple of decades, come into prominence and then, go back to sleep or whatever,
Yeah.
We're just rotating through these in terms of our popular culture, whatever the hell that means in an age that's, raised on micromedia. So.
Now, I just want to say though, I mean, it's not just that we're stuck in the 1920s. There is one very interesting phenomenon that happened in the 1920s. Now, history is full of traditional ages and ages of change. There's at least one book of the Bible, the Second Kings, which is just a long sequence of this king did things in the traditional way, and everything went well. Then his dipshit kid inherited the throne, he ignored tradition, and things went to shit.
The Semitic peoples need a firm hand.
I was going to say, like, can you imagine, like, a rich Jewish kid with a trust fund just being a complete fail-son after his parent made a bunch of money? Like, can you believe this happened?
Such people would never start bars or event spaces. Yeah.
Such unbelievable stories in the Bible, right? But we also talked about the Reformation in Scotland and how Scotland went from being a traditionally illiterate backwater to being one of the most educated places in the world by about the mid-18th century. And the fact is, history is full of times of stasis and times of change. That's nothing new. That's common throughout the Chronicles of the West. But here's the thing that was different about the 1920s. The people in the 1920s gave themselves a rather odd moniker. They said that the 1920s was the modern era, or modernity. We use the phrase modern art as shorthand for whatever piece of garbage that the artist has hauled in from the dump and referred to as conceptual. But modern art is actually a technical term. It means the art from about 1910 to 1972. That includes 1920s art, and it also includes people like Picasso, who did his avant-garde stuff in the early 1910s but got famous in the 20s. It refers to this specific time period where people are just eager to put World War I behind them. And even remember, we talked in the last episode about the Museum of Modern Art that opened in 1929.
MoMA.
Exactly, MoMA, yeah. But the weird thing, though, is that just if you think about it, any period in history is the modern era. Whatever time period you're growing up in the most modern time period. It's like that Mitch Hedberg joke. People will show you a picture and say, this is a picture of me when I was younger. Every picture is a picture of you when you were younger. It's the same thing about this word modernity. Technically speaking, every era is the modern era. Why did the people from the 20s decide that this time should be called modernity or the modern age?
Was it just that were they trying to be extra pretentious, or is there more to it?
Well, I think it goes back to that first slide I showed with all of the 20s video games. This was a time that people started to become sentimentally attached to the machines and started to believe that the machines are going to usher in a new future that are going to bring in different ideas and a different speed of progress. But in reality, the opposite happened. In reality, we just stopped moving culturally after the 20s. So why is that? And just to prove how much air was sucked out of the room over the 5 decades from 1920 to about 1972, it's not just that the art was ugly, it's that we don't have a word to describe what came after it. Like sometimes you'll hear art from the 70s onward referred to as contemporary, but the most common label is just postmodern.
Yep.
So where does that hubris come from? Like there's a certain hubris referring to yourself as the modern age. The first part of it is, like I said, World War I was such a catastrophe that a lot of people want something new that had nothing to do with the old aristocratic system that came before it. We looked at Tristan Tzara's Dada Manifesto in Switzerland, where he said that much explicitly.
This happens like anytime everything's blown up and there's a big push to modernize everything, or there's an opportunity to modernize everything, like in Japan.
In Western Europe, yes.
Yeah.
In Russia, progress happens at exactly one time in history, and that's when Russia loses a war badly.
They don't often lose wars.
They win wars with attrition, often decades-long attrition, but yeah, it's rare that they wave the white flag.
They're not running out of potatoes.
Or Gopniks.
Yeah, and they don't run out of potatoes. They're not running out of Gopniks. They got vodka and pierogi. It's all you need to grow a Gopnik. It's fully grown, 11 years old.
Yeah, so this attitude about getting rid of everything before World War I, a lot of fuel is thrown on that fire when Woodrow Wilson says, you know what Europe needs? It needs America to jump in and make this war even longer and bloodier. And they do. And the Americans won't accept peace until all of the major imperial governments on the continent are dissolved. The Habsburgs in Austria, the Hohenzollerns in Germany, the Romanovs in Russia, and the Ottomans, they're all going to be gone because the Americans have decided that they're going to make the world safe for democracy. That was the slogan they were using. Now, in the minds of the American ruling class, there's nothing unusual about saying, I've come up with an academic theory, I'm brilliant, and therefore we have to force other governments to follow my brilliant ideas, and nothing bad could ever happen because I'm just that brilliant. And when it comes to the World War I peace settlement, the plan was very simple. We are going to force every European country to do things in the more enlightened democratic way, and they're all going to be part of the League of Nations under our guidance, where we can force them, ideally with a gentle shove, but a firmer shove if they need it, to follow the next retarded idea that American academics come up with. And of course, in a classic show of the self-awareness we expect from American intellectuals, Woodrow Wilson could not get the votes in Congress to join the League of Nations himself.
Yep. You mean the ruling class might have been a little bit out of touch with the electorate?
After bombing a country somewhere else in the world and trying to install an ideological government there, yeah, that's just a real specific aberration to this point in history, isn't it? But yeah, in a truly representative example of American foresight, by making Europe safe for democracy at the barrel of a gun, it led to the rise of a very 20th century phenomenon, the dictator. The man who unilaterally rules his country with an iron fist and says, oh, no, it's okay, I'm doing it in the name of the people. Also, I'm not a hereditary monarch, so it's all cool. I'm good with the Americans. And once again, to impress the American ruling class, those dictators would always say that they were following some sort of an enlightened academic theory or ideology, just to give themselves legitimacy. And that's how we get this new word in the lexicon, totalitarianism. Now that word totalitarian, it conjures up images of death camps and bread lines and starving peasants and general misery. But that stuff happens throughout history. Totalitarian governments are a purely 20th century phenomenon in a world that the Americans had made safe for democracy. Totalitarianism is just Bonapartism. It is a group of people claiming to represent the will of the people so well that nobody is allowed to deviate from our ideology. Hitler has his plebiscites and focuses everything on the Volksgemeinschaft, or the people's community.
Sounds like a German gay bar.
Yeah, I'm sure there's one called that. It ends in Schaft. Every Soviet commissariat is called the people's this or the people's that. So that's almost a definition of totalitarianism, a system in the name of the people centered on an ideology.
Ask the North Koreans, if you could.
Well, what is the proper name of North Korea? It's the People's Democratic Republic of Korea.
Yeah, they still have sham elections with 100% of the vote for the Kim dictator.
To quote Curtis Yarvin, People's Democratic Republic of Korea means Democratic Democracy of Korea.
Yep. Yeah, these people want to make sure that you understand there's no totalitarianism going on at all.
So I've heard the argument that liberal democracy is also a totalitarian ideology, and don't get me wrong, the West is certainly getting there. And certain subjects are absolutely verboten in the West, like race science or Holocaust denial, or the idea that some organizations just run better without any women in them.
I had to go to combat sports to find out that like different haplotypes need different or have different average testosterone levels. Like,
forget like different genders in fighting sports. They have weight classes. Let's start with that.
Yep.
Those ideas, true or not, if you try to debate them, will just get you drummed out of polite society and possibly a job.
Even if you have a Nobel Prize.
Well, yeah, just think of the entire medical establishment forgetting that there are biological differences between men and women.
That would be cloud world.
Yeah. Well, just saying, we do have an ideology at the center of our society that our rulers demand fealty to, namely progressivism, which is the ruling ideology of the first couple decades of the 20th century. They call it the progressive era.
Ah, okay.
But again, we're talking about the 1910s and the 1920s, and that's kind of the first time that professors start getting taken seriously by the people in charge of society. Like before then, if you had listened to a professor for professional or governing advice, people would act like you just asked a gypsy to stare into a crystal ball. So, that again, we're stuck in this time period. There were things that just got set in our culture in the 1920s that we never moved past, one of which is the idea that professors should be taken seriously and consulted when making governing decisions, as opposed to saying, wait a second, these people can't even run their own lives.
And if you think that this is like a bygone way of thinking or doing things, they put a anthropology prof in charge of Afghanistan.
Archaeology prof, the same shit.
Archaeology? Oh, okay, great.
Whose daughter was a visual artist in Brooklyn.
There we go.
That's who you want in charge of Afghanistan, right?
In a bow. He's going to understand the tensions between the Pashtuns and the Turjiks. He's going to get to the heart of it.
So, I'm going to stop short of saying that liberal democracy is a totalitarian ideology, though. There certainly are some parallels. Like the Soviet Union, they had their apparatchiks and their commissars. Liberal democracies have their public policy professionals. But there's at least one thing we have in liberal democracies that they don't have in truly totalitarian governments.
Food.
Well, there's that too. they had food in Germany.
A little bit.
We have the illusion of choice. We have controlled opposition. In a truly totalitarian government, everybody has to be on the same page by force if necessary. But of all of the 20th century ideologies that come out of this period between the wars, like fascism, National Socialism, the various flavors of communism, they're all done in the name of the people, and humans being what we are, we don't respond to lofty debates about ideologies. We respond to propaganda. And every single one of these systems, including liberal democracy, they just rely on a heavy propaganda apparatus to keep the soma flowing. A lot of these artists that we either have looked at or we will be looking at, they're going to become important in the 1920s, not because of the aesthetic quality of their work, but because these dictators need propagandists.
So it's like a cult becoming a state religion.
Yeah, basically, yes. That's a good analogy.
Thank you.
Yeah, if the world is now safe for democracy, you need to convince the masses to enjoy the iron fist. And if you want to remake society in your image, some of the best propagandists are going to be radical avant-garde artists, many of whom will find out they're not terribly useful after the revolution happens.
Yeah, warning to revolutionaries.
Before we get to that, and we will get to that, across all of the creative endeavors in the 1920s in the modern era, you're going to see the same three things. Firstly, you're going to see an awareness of the industrialized world that the creatives are now living in. So you're not going to see any of this Jane Austen nostalgia for a quiet, old-fashioned life in the English countryside. You're going to see T.S. Eliot's love song of J. Alfred Prufrock about a guy having an existential crisis about how his life is comfortable but meaningless in a big city. Or you're going to get Leger's paintings of robots and automatons, the ones I showed earlier. You're going to get a Eugene O'Neill play that tries to delve into his character's psychology or portray the futility of having grandiose dreams in this bureaucratic society. You're going to have Kafka writing short stories about being a cog in a vast, sprawling bureaucracy a long time before the Dilbert comics do the same thing. Again, we're just stuck in the 20s. There are no Dilbert comics about anything that Kafka was not already writing about like 80 years earlier.
Now, the guy who wrote Dilbert has... Some ideas.
Yeah, about how to live and not to live in American cities.
Yeah. Just a Spurge, giving a Spurge answer. This is
Now, the second thing you're going to see in the 20s is you're going to see these creatives getting rid of superfluous ornamentation. This is going to be especially important when we look at architecture, when the Greek columns disappear and the concrete slabs are in.
function over form.
Yes, yeah, exactly. And it's functional reform, we say that facetiously now, but serious artists were talking about that stuff back then.
Yikes.
But it's not just seen in architecture, it's also seen in other art forms. Think about the writings of Ernest Hemingway. The diction is much more colloquial and the sentences are much more direct than the famously flowery Victorian language. Henry James said, "Her reputation of reading a great deal hung about her like the cloudy envelope of a goddess in an epic." Hemingway, on the other hand, said, "We ate dinner at Madame Lecomte's restaurant. It was crowded." So there you go. It's a lot more laconic.
Yeah, even like reading some of my great-grandfather's correspondence to the family, he wrote much more formally.
Yeah.
He used words like behooved. It's just, you can see writing getting less and less formal. I think maybe the ultimate evolution of that is like the text message.
Yeah. I wouldn't say less formal. I would say less ornamentation. I think that's the better way to think about it. They're just trying to get rid of everything superfluous.
Efficiency.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
I'd say efficiency is a better word than just informality.
Yeah. Okay, makes sense.
The third thing that you see across all of the creative endeavors in the 1920s is self-awareness of the form. Like James Joyce, he writes Ulysses, where he's trying to see what he can do with the novel. And if you've never taken a pretentious English class, every chapter of that book is written in a different style. And he uses things like stream of consciousness. He tries to portray a single ordinary day in Dublin as if it's an epic, hence it's called Ulysses.
Okay.
It's not just James Joyce, though. Marcel Proust, he tells a story using flashbacks triggered by the sensory experience of dropping a biscuit into a glass of tea.
Okay.
You have Faulkner, he writes The Sound and the Fury, where each chapter is a different character's stream of consciousness, including one chapter where the narrator is literally a retard.
That's awesome.
The first time I tried to read that, I was like, I just don't get this. What's going on here? Well, you have to realize that book was written in the 1920s when, again, that's just what authors are doing. They're trying to see what we can do with the form of the novel.
So I guess like maybe self-awareness might be a good...
Well, again, self-awareness of the medium.
Yeah.
And it's not just the novel. Like E.E. Cummings, he starts writing poems that play with punctuation and typesetting. You have Stravinsky, he starts writing music with intentionally weird rhythms. You have Schoenberg, who writes atonal music, which means it uses every note on the piano keyboard, so there's no key signature of it. You have Man Ray, who does this weird photography involving pre-exposing the film.
Like that chick from our first episode.
We're actually going to be talking about her. We're going to be calling back to her.
Lotus!
Yeah, we're going to be calling back to her. Don't worry. You have Martha Graham. She's the one who introduces modern dance, and it's literally called modern dance because it's from the 20s. That's where you instead of having traditional ballet dancing, you have all these anorexic girls flopping around on the floor.
Yikes.
You have Bertolt Brecht. He writes theater and plays that break the fourth wall, or in some cases where the fourth wall just doesn't even exist. If you've taken a history of theater class, you've probably heard of 6 Characters in Search of an Author. And all that stuff was long since played out by the time This Is a Play was written.
Yeah, and everybody who was a theater kid is going to at some point have had to do This Is a Play.
And in some works from the 1920s, you get all 3 of these things. Think about Ravel's Bolero, which is minimalistic. It's really just a 17-minute crescendo. It's almost mechanical, playing on a slight variation of the same bar over and over. And it's certainly self-aware of the fact that it's playing with the form of classical music. In my first year of university, I took a class on the history of theater, and 17-year-old me thought I was being cultured by listening to some crazy Russian woman talking about how, as time went on, theater went from Shakespeare to like Beckett and Death of a Salesman, and now it's like a bunch of fat women pretending to menstruate on stage.
Pretending if you're lucky.
Yeah, well, you know, if you're not pretending, what's the point? You can just go free bleed on the street corner like every other street preacher. I guess street preachers don't get cultural grants, is the only difference.
Ironically, these people like, scream for like authenticity in a medium where it's like, that's the whole point is you're supposed to not be authentic. Like that's not.
Yeah, well, just like art, there is a narrative about how over the centuries playwrights start playing with the rules and winking at the audience, and it's all bullshit. It's kind of bullshit somebody would tell you if they used the word like dramaturg to describe their job description.
Jesus, what a pretentious, awful human being would do that.
It's bullshit because it's just the 1910s and 20s when every creative is trying to see what they can do with the form. And I can't stress this enough. This idea of creativity through deconstruction of the form, that's just the zeitgeist for a few years before, during, and after World War I. That's it. That's not something that was happening over the centuries. There's not some sort of meta-narrative that goes from like the Renaissance up to today. It's just something that people did for a couple of years in like 1922, where you said, okay, I'm a painter, let's see what I can do with the idea of painting in general, and then they moved on to other things. As the narrative goes, in the 1920s, the old capital R romantic ways of doing things are over. Whether it's true or not, the claim is that we're going to get rid of this Victorian flowery prose and poetry because people are tired of it. You know, it's almost played out to the point where it appears on greeting cards. Again, as the story goes, people are getting tired of hearing the same formulaic symphonies over and over. But the aftermath of World War I, it now gives us a chance to wipe the slate clean and do things in a new way for a new century, free from all these antiquated conventions. So the 20th century is going to be a time when art goes in all sorts of new and interesting ways based on this new and interesting world we live in.
And like the Cambrian, these are going to be like the Cambrian explosion.
Yeah.
It's going to be baked into later evolution.
Exactly, and that's what they fully expected to happen, and it just went nowhere. The truth is, across the arts, in the 1920s, you had the exact same hubris that led society to call itself the modern age.
Well, I think you see, like, even in our own worldview, you see that humor, like, right? Like,
Well, totally. People who come up with an idea for how to change the world in a better way, get their friend in government to write it into policy, then put it on their resume. Here's the example: is somebody who pats himself on the back for getting a safe injection site opened, then doesn't, come back in 5 years to see what's happened to the neighborhood.
Yep.
Yeah, that's exactly the same hubris we're talking about here. The creatives of the 1920s, they were people who were trained in how to make art in the proper way, but they were just deciding to break the rules. But after the 20s, you have a new generation of artists thinking that it's now the job of the artist to push the rules even farther and to push the envelope. And after a few decades, you have a stainless steel balloon dog selling for $58 million and a banana being duct taped to a wall. The thing about breaking the rules is you can really only do it once.
Yeah.
Like losing your virginity.
But in trying to break convention, they created modern convention.
Basically, yes.
Okay.
Well, like I said, the last wave of creativity was in the late 90s in Hollywood, and they were just doing the exact same thing people were doing in the 20s.
Yeah, it's the rehashing of this vital period.
Yeah, like 19th century literature, it certainly blurred the lines, especially using things like irony and analogy. But once you broke the rules in the 1920s, just entropy starts to take hold. And by the time you reach the 1960s, if we're going to talk about theater, all you can do is pretend that Waiting for Godot is something profound. It isn't. The only thing that Beckett can really do to be creative at this point, or at least to be creative with the form, is to just write really weird stage directions. In fact, that's what any history of theater class will tell you, that Beckett was pioneering playwright because he wrote weird stage directions.
My read on that play is that it's like a Rorschach test. Like you have to bring your own interpretation to it. It's that ultimate breaking of the fourth wall.
Well, my read on the play is just that we're out of new ideas.
Yep.
It starts in the 1920s with like 6 characters in search of an author, and just by the 1960s it runs out of gas. Like, we're left with all of these English 101 narratives about how artists got the freedom to break the rules as time went on. Just think about it. Does that honestly make sense? What ever stopped a mediocre poet from writing shitty poetry in the year 1795?
Yeah.
You know, he could have said he was playing with the rules as well, but nobody would have seen him as a genius. People always wondered why Harvey Weinstein was so talented. He could take a stack of 100 scripts on his desk and say these 6 are going to make great movies. I am convinced that I know what his secret was.
Well, we all know what his secret was now. It's kind of an open secret.
One of his secrets.
Okay.
He also certainly knew how to be the great filter to make sure actresses were truly devoted to their craft.
Yeah. You want to make it a knot, sweetheart.
I am convinced that all Harvey Weinstein ever did was figured out which scripts played with the form of cinema the way that 20s painting and literature played with their own forms. Like, Weinstein made sure to never choose the equivalent of a Jackson Pollock painting or a Waiting for Godot. He never went too far off the rails. He always chose 1920s irreverence, not like 1970s irreverence.
Okay.
Just as an example, let's take a look at some of his more notable works, which either achieved critical acclaim or a cult following. And everything on this list, it either plays with the form of the movie, it either strips things down to its bare bones, or it has characters dealing with their place in this mechanical, bureaucratic, computerized society. So those same 3 things we talked about earlier. Let's just go right down the list. First of all, we mentioned Tarantino and Pulp Fiction earlier. Tarantino had his nonlinear storytelling, but more importantly, Tarantino, he was a self-taught filmmaker, and what is Kill Bill other than a James Joyce-esque film where he tells a story by shooting each chapter using a completely different style?
Yep.
It's exactly what James Joyce did with Ulysses.
Yeah, that's a good insight.
Like, film wasn't an established art form in the 1920s, but if it was, somebody would have been doing exactly what Tarantino was doing with Kill Bill. And even then, it wasn't that original. Fellini was already deconstructing the art form in the 60s when he did 8½, which if you haven't seen that movie, it was a movie about a director having writer's block while trying to direct a science fiction movie. So again, it was already done by Fellini in the 60s.
Wow.
But let's look at the rest of the movies on the Harvey Weinstein catalog. Trainspotting, that's minimalist. That's certainly an honest look at modernity.
Certainly an honest look at Scotland.
Well, that's what I mean. It's not like Braveheart.
Yeah.
It's not a romantic view of Scotland. It's a view of Scotland as it is right now, warts and all.
Those 2 movies should always be a double feature.
For the people who think that the arc of history is long but bends toward progress, there you go.
Yep.
It bends towards Trainspotting.
Yep.
The Big Lebowski, there's another movie that certainly plays with the form.
I'm going through all my favorites here.
Well, yeah, I mean, first of all, they said it was based on, like, the form of the Raymond Chandler novel. Like, not based on a specific book, but just the idea of an old detective novel where there's lots of ins, lots of outs, lots of twists.
Hipsters always insisted to me angrily at the door after I'd thrown them out and had referenced Big Lebowski that it was based on The Big Sleep.
It was based on Raymond Chandler's novels, but it was not based on that specific book. It was just based on a meandering detective story where at the end of it, most details are meaningless.
Okay.
Like, they said it. They said it in an interview. I'm not making that up. This is straight from the horse's mouth. They said it was based on a Raymond Chandler type novel where There's a lot of, it's a very complex movie, but all the details are just completely meaningless when you get to the end of it. Kids, that's certainly a minimalist movie.
Holy shit, yeah.
In Donnie Darko, there's a movie with parallel storylines. If you want a movie about unvarnished society, Bad Santa.
Yeah, that's one of the classics. I think that's the Christmas movie for anyone whose busy season is the holidays.
Like I said, it's not Jane Austen romanticism. It's let's look at the world as it is right now. That's very 20s-esque. Shaun of the Dead, there's a self-aware take on the genre.
Yeah, good point.
Clerks, that movie was meta and self-aware.
Yeah. Funded by credit card fraud.
True.
Discovered by Weinstein.
And more importantly, distributed by Weinstein.
Yeah.
If you're a Gentile and you want to make it in Hollywood, the tribe will let you into most creative endeavors in Hollywood. They will not let you into distribution.
It's family only.
It's also the bottleneck.
There's two groups of people you got to network with if you want to make it in Hollywood. I don't know if this has changed, but you got to go to the Scientology school and you got to go to AA.
Yeah.
Really, that's how you network to actually get parts. So I don't know, that's back when that was a thing. I'm sure it's like now based on how many freaking followers you have.
Yeah, I've heard that these days Hollywood is just a bunch of like 17-year-old TikTok influencers who are getting paid to all live in a mansion together.
Oh yeah, like there's a whole underbelly of like IRL streamers, like this Ice Poseidon and like Johnny Somali is an example of that. And it's like the the catch in the bottom of your sink. Like it's all these people who should be not amoral people, untalented people, but because the entry level's so low now because the technology's so cheap, you're getting this freaking slop content of their lives. And then like Andy Dick goes and does that. Like it's the drain caught Andy Dick. Okay, the catch,
To be fair, in the 90s, we all knew the drain was going to catch Andy Dick.
And Bam Marguerite. He's now hanging out with these IRL streamer people.
That's what happens when you're a member of Jackass who does not get killed in a car accident from drunk driving.
Yeah.
And speaking of data, there's another perfect example, Jackass.
Yep. Oh, I want to give Tom Green his due. And also like crappy 90s skate punk culture that like placed so little value on life that like bum fights and Jackass could become like phenomenons in skate shops. Anyway.
Yeah, and just to finish off the list of Harvey Weinstein's oeuvre, No Country for Old Men, that movie got rid of ornamentation, specifically it got rid of background music. There's like a few bars of background music in that movie, but there's almost no background music in that movie.
Homie drank his milkshake, man. What was he going to do?
So it's almost a cliche that these movies are described as psychological or gritty or whimsical. And all of those words are straight out of the 1920s zeitgeist. In some ways, that's the reason that those movies worked. They pretended to be breaking rules, but in reality, they were just staying within these well-established boundaries that we just don't realize exist. We're just fish unaware of the waters in which we swim, and those waters were put in place in the mid-20s. And that kind of leads us back to the moment where we left off. Like the last episode, it was a bottle episode that just looked at Monet's water lilies. But before that, our narrative left off in 1917 at a moment that every art history calls a pivotal moment, and yet nobody can explain why. Because if we are deconstructing painting, and we are deconstructing the novel, and we are deconstructing music and poetry, and we're even deconstructing the ballet, allowing women to flop around on the floor, why not just deconstruct art itself?
Oh, God, this guy.
This incorrectly oriented urinal, signed with the pseudonym R. Mutt, was placed in a New York art gallery by a guy named Marcel Duchamp. And if you recall, we talked about this 2 episodes ago, he spent the war living in New York City. He, Francis Picabia, and Man Ray, they are sometimes retroactively known as New York Dada, but it's really just these 3 douchebags who later on moved to Paris and joined Paris Dada. In 1917, Duchamp, he sat on the board of an art organization which was having an unjuried art show that they said would accept anything. So he turned a urinal on its side, signed it R. Mutt, and submitted it anonymously as a sculpture under the name Fountain.
Now, I think about all the beautiful artwork that was destroyed by ISIS, and then I see that, like, this is, still was not destroyed by them. So,
Oh, even better. This thing was probably lost because it was just a toilet. At some point in the 60s, they decided to mass produce these things to put them in modern art galleries. So it's not just that this thing is not being destroyed by ISIS. It's now we have factories reproducing these things and museums treating it as authentic.
jeez. Yeah, if anyone doubts that we're in a decline, that's kind of fitting for this kind of art. It has, commodification.
So the organization that was running the art show, they said they promised to accept anything, but they did not display the urinal in the gallery, and they just kept it in the back room. So in response to this, Duchamp resigned from the board in protest, and a publication, and I'm sure it was just a total coincidence that Duchamp worked as an editor.
This guy sounds like a pain in the ass.
Yeah, he was. He was the original Sacha Baron Cohen, as we talked about in the last episode. This publication, it ran 2 editorials arguing that this urinal was truly art. Here's a couple of famous passages, and these are direct quotes. Some contended that it was plagiarism, a plain piece of plumbing. Whether Mr. Mott, with his own hands, made the fountain or not has no importance. He chose it. He chose an ordinary article of life, placed it so that its useful significance disappeared under the new title and point of view, and created a new thought for that object. As for plumbing, this is absurd. The only works of art America has given are her plumbing and her bridges. So first of all, it's not he just created a new thought by finding this urinal in a hardware store. He created a new thought by, what did it say? It created a new point of view. So he oriented it the wrong way. Because again, if you are of the female persuasion, urinals are not oriented this way.
This would not be a useful configuration.
No, it would splash. Here's another quote from a different editorial in the same publication. I confess I do not know much about art with a big A, but this fountain was really beautiful, with its smooth flowing curves, its soft gleaming surface. It had a sort of spiritual effulgence. Why should we not see beauty in it, even though it be the beauty of the grotesque? The young man who made this fountain did not model it with his hands. He chose it. He took an article of life, an object which had a definite daily use, and by giving it a new environment, a new point of view, he made it say something. That's what art is.
You might call, I think it's this found art.
Yeah.
Is what the guy argued it was
Yeah,
called.
objet trouvé, found objects or ready-mades.
Now this, splashing back to the world of IRL streamers, Andy Dick was bringing garbage into his streaming house, and they asked him what he was doing, and he says, "Oh, it's found art."
Exactly.
So
He was quoting this guy. He was making a direct reference to this. And again, because this stuff just never went anywhere, nothing came in to replace the zeitgeist of the 20s. You can't even say Andy Dick was wrong.
Nope.
You can say he's wrong about a lot of things, especially when it comes to managing his own life, but he wasn't wrong about that. This stuff about creating a new point of view and a new environment for a urinal, it has always seemed like sophistry to me. It's always seemed like bullshit. Current intellectuals talk about this like it's a milestone in the history of art because Duchamp made us ask what art truly is. That is just not a good enough explanation for me. That's like the Chewbacca defense if you're old enough to have watched early South Park.
Yeah.
Like, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Chewbacca lives on Endor. That does not make sense. Or whatever it was. I don't remember how it went. But
That's where it went.
Yeah, that's what it sounds like when you say Duchamp made us question what really art is. That just sounds like Johnny Cochran on South Park.
Yeah, some verbal sleight of hand, as you might say.
That's not even sleight of hand. It's just straight up obfuscation. Like, you're just throwing so much bullshit at the audience that they just don't have time to scratch their head and say, wait a second, this doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, speaking of 1920s, give them the old razzle-dazzle. It's a Chicago reference for any of you Philistines that aren't up on your musical theater.
So yeah, you put forth a ridiculous argument about what art truly is, and then you mock people for not getting it. And then you teach the next generation of liberal arts majors that Duchamp made us ask what art truly is. And then they start parroting it, and they're proud of the fact that they got an A in the class. Like, I don't know.
Rinse and repeat.
Now that we live in the age of YouTube and the university does not have the monopoly on this anymore, I just don't need to nod and pretend to follow along anymore. I can just call bullshit on it, and that's what I'm doing. You know, at least when James Joyce wrote Ulysses, he was seeing what he could do with the novel as a form, and you can call that book pretentious if you want to, but he was at least a talented writer. When T.S. Eliot wrote The Wasteland, he was seeing what he could do with the poem as a form. Like, that's what Duchamp claims to have been doing in the age of deconstructing art forms. He was saying, I'm an artist, so let's see what I can get away with and still call myself an artist. But that's not something timeless and profound.
Well, it's not something we should be venerating.
No, but it's just not something that you can think about as a general first principle from which everything is derived. This is just the zeitgeist of the period between 1910 and 1925, when intellectuals are talking about Sigmund Freud, and they're looking at this hyper-mechanized, industrialized society and seeing New Jerusalem and a utopia run by intellectuals. And they're thinking that it's time to be revolutionary for the sake of doing something new and different. Put it this way, in 2009, if you went to a dive bar in a big city and saw a hipster doing an acoustic cover of a hardcore song, you'd shrug your shoulders and say, you know what, it's 2009, this kind of hipster irreverence is in vogue. If you did that now, if you saw somebody doing that now, your response would be, what the fuck is this guy doing? It's not 2009 anymore. So when people are doing this, when Andy Dick is doing this found art stuff, your response to that should just be, what the fuck are you doing? It's not 1917 anymore.
Old hat, Andy. Put the garbage back in the yard.
If anybody tries to pretend this stuff is profound, like, it isn't. If it was shocking, it's only because New York was not yet culturally important enough to matter on the world stage. But if Duchamp had done this in a European city that was not at war, like Amsterdam or Barcelona, nobody would have cared. It would have just been, all right, so it goes. This is the modern era. But there's one big difference between Marcel Duchamp and Ezra Pound or Ernest Hemingway or even Quentin Tarantino. And that's that those guys were all well-trained in their creative endeavor of choice, and they chose to deconstruct the endeavor. Duchamp was just deconstructing art as a whole. And the one thing that we have hammered on in this series is that art has never really been a very well-defined term in the first place. This definition of the word art that we use, it did not enter the lexicon until Joshua Reynolds became the head of the Royal Academy in the 1760s. And after that, there was a general idea that art was just whatever painting and sculpture was coming out of the Royal Academy and the Académie des Beaux-Arts. By the 1870s, paint was cheap enough, and there was enough new money out there that people could be working painters outside of the formal system, and some of them called themselves artists. But even the Impressionists, the linchpin of every narrative about art, they called themselves artistic painters. They did not call themselves artists. So you had Bouguereau painting the old-fashioned academic paintings for the Paris Salon. You had Cézanne and Van Gogh painting the weird shit with cheap paint in Montmartre. And the word artist was used to describe both of these people. But in the previous episode, I likened this to the word musician, describing both the guy who plays the oboe in the symphony and the hipster playing the acoustic guitar in Brooklyn. Like in 1897, you had the Vienna Secession, which was the first group to formally say that we are breaking from the Academy and that they are going to be the true custodians of art going forward. But, you know, the word art is just constantly being redefined to mean whatever these pretentious fuckers need it to be for whatever argument they're making. Like, they're constantly saying we are working against the academies, so art is just whatever the academies were doing wrong and we're doing right. So when Duchamp came along and said, I'm deconstructing the concept of art by putting a urinal in an art gallery, you can't even argue with it, because what does art even mean? Arguably, any coherent idea of art was already finished, and Duchamp was just gilding the lily. Like, maybe you just can't put Humpty Dumpty back together once he was broken. You can still be a painter or a sculptor or an engraver or an illustrator, but you just can't really be an artist anymore.
That ship sailed.
Or maybe it's the opposite ship. Maybe the bar has been set so low that everybody can be an artist and the term is meaningless.
Congratulations, everybody.
I'm not even taking a side in that. I'm just putting the question out there. All I can really say is that when it comes to prestige art, the art that ends up in the culture pages of the New York Times, there is not a single thing done since the 1920s that was not already done in or before the 1920s. And society would not be any worse off if we just retired this concept of the artist altogether. Now, of course, this did not stop anybody from using the word in the 1920s. When the guy duct taped the banana to the wall, it was completely derivative, and it was easily something that could have been done by Duchamp or the Dadaists in the 20s. But there is one difference, and that's that in the 20s, nobody was paying $6 million for some stupid attention whoring stunt. Yet some crypto billionaire paid $6 million for the banana. And yes, I understand a lot of this is money laundering, but the art somehow now has the imprimatur of the cultural elites and the university system. And we need to explore how we got to that point. So whatever concept of art was created by Joshua Reynolds and propagated forward throughout the Romantic era in the 19th century, it's dead by the 20s, and World War II completely delivers the kill shot to it.
You cannot do art if you're dead.
Well, I'm just at this point, I'm going to lay out my case for the rest of the series, just to give you a roadmap for where we're going, though.
It's going to be your syllabus.
Yeah, exactly. First of all, a completely new activity arises in the 1920s. It is defined by a new place in society. After World War I and Woodrow Wilson's peace settlement forces democracy on Europe, the state is now viewed as the proper vehicle to enact any sort of grand overarching vision. And what we call the artist is almost exclusively a propagandist for the administrative state or for one of its appendages, whether that appendage is a university or a corporation or an organization like MoMA.
Okay. That's why it's always got a political bent of some kind.
Yeah, absolutely, completely. Now, like, now that paint is cheap, anybody can take painting classes and sell their paintings, but you are not going to occupy the cultural position of a Vincent van Gogh or a Jackson Pollock or an Andy Warhol. And you are certainly not going to get into the culture section of the New York Times. It's just not going to happen. Secondly, this urinal stunt. It may be talked about as a pivotal turning point, but it did not change jack shit. Any attention whore can do something silly, and it doesn't change the culture. Johnny Somali is not changing the culture of Japan or Korea, no matter how many times he gets arrested over there. Duchamp is just the guy who personifies what was already going on during the modern age as every creative endeavor was deconstructing itself. He was not some sort of visionary. He just took what was already happening and saw where the real line was. But modernity was already going to wash everything away with or without Duchamp. Third, many of these avant-garde artists from before World War I, they become propagandists after World War I, and these people are genuinely worth studying, but only as historical figures for the same reason Joseph Goebbels is. Okay. Speaking of failed artists.
Yeah.
But that is in no way a continuation of the story of art, which is defined somewhat tenuously.
Okay.
Fourthly, Academics in the 40s and 50s, they are going to make a genuine attempt to square the circle and reconcile the story of Michelangelo with Picasso and Pollock. When you read their writing, they know full well that it seems like two different activities, but they are going to produce a narrative that starts in the Renaissance and progresses in one unbroken line to this urinal. We have beaten it to death in this series that every narrative talks about the Impressionists as being radicals, but when you take a close look at them, they don't seem that radical or even that important in their own day. The Impressionists are going to be the key to this narrative that comes out of the 40s and 50s that tries to square the circle. And finally, this narrative from the 40s and 50s, it's the narrative which we are still expected to accept today, but it's going to run headfirst into reality in the 1960s with the rise of Jasper Johns and Andy Warhol. That's when avant-garde turned its back on this highfalutin abstract shit and a bunch of artsy-fartsy theories about color and harmony, and everybody starts paying attention to Andy Warhol as he paints grocery store products and videotapes New York crackheads in drag.
Yeah, I was going to say he's the first guy to like tape the homeless.
Yeah, yes, yeah. And in the 1970s, right around the time that Octavio Paz made his observation about modern art, we talked about that in the first episode, go back and listen to that if you want to, but he made a quote about modern art losing its power of negation. That happens right around this time in the 1970s, and that's when these academic theories, they just fail extra hard. And that's what delivers the kill shot to modernity. The word art is now a dead concept twice over, once in the 20s and once in the 70s. And that's why nobody can explain why or even whether a banana duct taped to a wall truly is or isn't art. It's like asking whether or not it's real alchemy. It's just a question that doesn't make sense.
What kind of magic?
Exactly. So that's the roadmap, but we still have to get there. And if you've never seen Kurosawa's Rashomon, you have almost certainly seen a TV show making a reference to it. It's a film about an incident that takes place in the woods involving 4 characters. And every character gives an account of what happened. So you have the same story told 4 times, but by 4 very unreliable narrators with different levels of accuracy or different levels of honesty. And so the details don't always even match up between the accounts of the event. Now, every TV show from The X-Files to King of the Hill to Happy Days to Star Trek to Arrested Development, they all had a Rashomon episode centered on some event that was described multiple times in multiple flashbacks that just don't quite line up. That's what it's like looking at 1920s art. Because at this point, art is still something done by a small number of people for a small number of collectors in a small number of cities. But there's a new wrinkle, and that's what I mentioned earlier. And that's that the age of democracy is the age of dictatorship. And one person can command anything he wants as long as he doesn't call himself a king and claims he's doing it in the name of the people, and he needs to propagandize the shit out of those people. And in this milieu, dictators need propagandists, especially if they want to overthrow the old aristocratic or imperial order. And these radical avant-garde artists, they're going to make the perfect propagandists for a strongman saying it's time for a change.
The original InfoWars.
Yeah, exactly. And as I said before, all of these people, they always seem to get thrown away very shortly after the revolution.
Yeah, take notes, revolutionaries.
So that's where the story of art in the 20s really begins. Because yes, we're going to talk about the Dadaists, and we're going to talk about the Surrealists, and we're going to talk about Bauhaus. That's all standard fare 1920s art stuff. But we're not going to miss the forest for the trees. And that's that between the wars, the 4 most important names in art are Lenin, Stalin, Mussolini, and Hitler.
Oh, Hitler would be so happy to hear that.
It's not for his art, though.
No.
It's for his opinions on art.
Oh. Yeah, he had some very strong opinions on art.
Yeah, so you can talk about how all of the weird art done by Giorgio de Chirico and Vasily Kandinsky and Marc Chagall represent this movement or that movement, but in reality, we remember all three of those artists because they were high-ranking propagandists in the service of some dictator. Nobody remembers Goebbels because he wrote expressionist plays.
Yep, and he did. Awful, awful place.
So the story of art in the 1920s, it's really the story of art from four different perspectives, all of which are told by unreliable narrators. First of all, you have art in Paris, which is still the center of the avant-garde world, and for a few years it's dominated by the Dadaists, who are not exactly known for their honesty or their reliable accounts. But you also have the story of art in Italy, Germany, and the Soviet Union. And if you're keeping score, each one of those three countries is going to be the realm of a dictator who rules with an iron fist.
What a strange coincidence.
Yes. In the case of Italy and the Soviet Union, those dictators are going to be in charge for the 20s. In the case of Germany, that dictator in question, he does not come to power until the 30s, but he is certainly going to have strong opinions on the art scene of the Weimar Republic, thus making Berlin crucial to the story as well. So this and the next episode are going to be our Rashomon story, as we tell the story of art in Paris, Moscow, Rome, and Berlin. And by looking at what happens in each of those four cities in the 20s, we will hopefully emerge with a picture of what happened in the most crucial decade of the last century and a half. And that's when the parameters of our world, and certainly the parameters of our culture, are going to be firmly set. And finally, we are going to get definitive answers to some, not all, but some of the questions about why modern art is just so fucking hideous.
I can't wait.
So for our first Rashomon story, we are going to go to fascist Italy, and as a bit of a prologue, we're going to talk about one artist in particular. This is Giorgio de Chirico. Now, de Chirico is sometimes referred to as the forerunner of Surrealism, though he would have never said that himself because he hated the Surrealists. But just looking at this painting, in true modernist style, he's clearly trying to play with the idea of the Renaissance painting. Like, we talked about the perspective lines in an old episode where all the lines that are parallel in real life on the canvas, they all converge in the distance in one point. Like, those perspective lines are just obnoxiously obvious here. Yeah. But it's not just the perspective lines, the shading and color palette, it's not just that they're unrealistic, it's that they're almost cartoonish and dreamlike.
Yeah. Some otherworldly about this.
Yeah, exactly. So just like all of the other 1920s modernists, de Chirico, he was trained in the classical methods and chose to bend the rules. He calls these paintings metaphysical, and you can clearly see what inspires the later works of Salvador Dali. It's not hard to see the influence there. Now, before the war, de Chirico, he is like any other Paris bohemian. He spends his time in the cafes, in the salons, and the cenacles.
Absinthe drinking bum.
Yep, pretty much. As they all were.
Yep.
He was having these intellectual conversations with all the other artistes and people like Apollinaire. And the writings of Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung are just starting to come into vogue. So he's inspired by Freud's writings on dreams and the subconscious. Now, Freud and Jung, they are not exactly scientific, but it's an age of utopian thinking about science, so artists love to prove how smart they are by talking about psychoanalysis and Darwinian evolution and quantum physics. Like, you see all three of those come up time and time again, not just in the various manifestos of the era, but when hipsters try to sound intelligent today, they still talk about this stuff.
Yeah, when I was an obnoxious young absinthe drinker myself, what did we talk about to try and sound smart? These same things.
Yep. Yeah, now, did the creatives actually understand any of these concepts back then? No, but when has that ever stopped anybody from pretentiously talking about science?
The great tragedy of our time is the philosophers have not kept up with the scientists.
No talented person really makes a career out of pushing the envelope. You know, either you have somebody like Ezra Pound who does his weird cantos poetry where he does things like including Chinese characters. He does that for a few years, then he tones it down and goes back to being a more traditional writer.
Like Howard Stern.
Yep. Well, you have, like I said, you have people like Picasso. He becomes a celebrity. He doesn't necessarily tone it down, but he spends the last 50 years of his life just doing the same thing over and over. The Dadaists, they're basically done within 4 years. Even Duchamp himself, he retires from art and devotes the rest of his life to studying and playing chess. So there's an expiration date on a career out of shocking the audience. Look at Sacha Baron Cohen. Like, he was famous for a few years, and then the shtick wore thin.
You can only get into so many wrestling. You can only get into so many like wrestling matches with naked guys. Like, it just stops being shocking at a certain point.
Well, like, even when he tried being like a normal comedic actor in all of his movies, somehow he shoved something up his ass.
Yeah,
I don't understand it. Even the movie about the Chavs, he ended up with like a rocket shoved up his ass.
Yeah, there's a theme there. I think homies, as Freud might say, there may be some latency. Some latent tendencies there.
I understand having an anal fixation, but usually that means you want to be the one sticking the thing into the anus? I don't know.
Not at his synagogue.
But, like, you know who makes a lifetime out of shocking the audience, though? Washed up professional wrestlers and women receiving cultural grants. Those are the people who make a lifetime out of doing it. The people who truly advance culture, the people who truly become avant-garde artists and shock the audience, they only do it for a few years, and then either the shtick wears thin, or else they're talented enough and they say, all right, I'm not going to spend my whole career just being Borat.
Yeah. South Park guys, too. Another example. They're still plenty dirty, but you notice they're like talking about loftier things than they might have in earlier seasons. Like,
there's less just straight up fart jokes.
Yeah, they don't kill Kenny anymore.
Yeah, so De Chirico, he is the example par excellence of the guy who does weird avant-garde stuff for a few years and then goes back to normal. He is one of the first to say, you know what? This boundary pushing stuff, it got real old real fast. There's no shortage of small groups of bohemians living there's no shortage of small groups of bohemians living in some European city who are going to write a manifesto or some other declaration talking about how all art up until now is nonsense and we are going to wrest the creative duties from the official art establishment. We've already talked about some of these groups, but in 1919, in the aftermath of the war, De Chirico writes an essay titled Return to Craft, which is the complete opposite of these manifestos. So again, the narrative talks about how going into the 20s, all of the artists wanted to do something different. No, here is a primary document from 1919, so even 1 year before the 1920s, which is the complete contradiction of that.
So this is the guy who's like, guys, we're forgetting how to build aqueducts and roads.
Yes, that's exactly who he is. He says in this essay that we've spent the last 50 years being, quote, polluted by the coloristic foolishness that has invaded Europe. He doesn't explicitly mention the Impressionists or the Post-Impressionists like Van Gogh, but if you do the math and subtract 50 years from 1919, he is very clearly talking about them as being the moment that the train went off the track. And he says that after 50 years, Paris's avant-garde has completely worn itself out, constantly trying to do something new and different, and falling back on words like spirituality when people give them funny looks. So now, the avant-garde painters, they are ready to do something serious again, but there's one little problem. Nobody can draw a human body properly anymore.
Oops.
That's what happens when you try to push the envelope for 50 years. He doesn't necessarily say anything bad about Cezanne and his crooked perspectives, but he definitely has some choice words for the young artists who want to imitate Cezanne's style and still call themselves visionaries.
I asked the head of the style of karate I did as a young man when he came to visit my dojo. I said, Hanshi, what is the secret to being good at karate? And he said, 3 things: basic training, and basic training.
Yep.
So if you lose the fundamentals, you're screwed.
Yep. Well, that's exactly what De Chirico's talking about. And again, this idea that the whole avant-garde was ready to, move into the 20s and push the envelope even farther, bullshit. And this essay is proof of that. He's careful not to say a bad word specifically about the Fauvists, Cubists, Expressionists, etc. After all, the guy just made a name for himself as an avant-garde artist doing these weird metaphysical paintings. But just as punk rock had a few years in the 70s and 80s, followed by 3 decades of whiny, melodic, and cookie-cutter shit, De Chirico is decrying all of the young artists who are using these weird painting techniques to mask the fact that they're just mediocre painters with a trust fund.
Guys, you can't play the guitar. You can have all the leather jackets and makeup and hair dye you want. If you don't know how to play the guitar, your art's going to suck.
And even if you can play the guitar, is Green Day really anything edgy? No, it isn't.
SoCal punk.
He calls all of this art mistakes which are prudishly veiled with stylistic contortions, which I think sums it up pretty accurately. And this is 100 years ago, somebody saying this. De Chirico talks about how in the old days, students at the academy would spend 5 years just learning how to draw, drawing plaster casts, learning every single body part, learning how to draw naked bodies, then learning how to draw how clothes hang on the body. Then after you went through that, you had to learn how to set up models, and you had to learn chiaroscuro. And he asks about all of these avant-garde painters, are they really visionaries, or are they just lazy and taking shortcuts?
Yep. As you bring up punk rock.
Yeah.
Great example.
Well, the punk rockers, they at least knew that they had no ambition. Punk rock was specifically about having no ambition. It was knowing that once you were part of the punk scene, nobody was ever going to take you seriously, either as a musician or as a respectable member of society.
So you're arguing they were the juggalos of the 70s.
I'm arguing that once punk people pushed the envelope, what could you do but push the envelope farther with juggalos?
Yeah, that's fair. What are juggalos but punk rock and glam rock and rap mixed together in like urban poverty in Detroit, right?
So this is just at odds with almost every art history book that says at the turn of the century, the arts are in crisis. People are tired of Victorian poetry turning into kitschy greeting card slogans. Then in the 1920s, they decide it's time for a change, and they do things to represent the mechanical world. This essay that I'm reading to you right now, it's by one of the most renowned avant-garde artists, and in 1919, before the 20s even begins, he's decrying the whole endeavor. And worse, he says that things might not even be recoverable, because the academies are now staffed by these avant-garde pieces of shit, who will let in a new student if he can do a nice charcoal sketch. Like that's like letting.
Well, talk about entropy.
Without proving a mastery of drawing, that's like letting a kid into Juilliard's music program if he can't play the scales.
Yeah. The reason that my little town had such a good ska scene in the 90s is because it had a little bit of money, and a lot of kids had to do music lessons. So that, when it came to just playing ska, we punched above our weight, because the kids knew the basics in terms of musicianship.
Yep.
So
in episode 1, I said we were calling bullshit on the endeavor of modern art. Here it is, De Chirico in black and white calling it all out. He said that if you want to be an artist, please save up your money, get a plaster cast reproduction of Michelangelo's David or any other classical sculpture, and just keep drawing it until you know how every tendon in the human body works. He says that yes, it's a bit dehumanizing to lock people up for 5 years and tell them to draw, but it's a necessary part of the discipline. It's character building.
Yeah.
In 1919, De Chirico is already saying, look guys, I've done it. I've made it in the Paris avant-garde scene. This shit is done. These avant-garde people have 3 paintbrushes that are crusted with dried paint. Are we really going to compare them to an academic master who had 100 paintbrushes constantly washed and dried by his assistants? Like, no, they're not the same thing. And he finishes with a swipe at the futurists. He says that some people are saying that futurism was necessary, but that's nonsense because that's like saying the war was necessary. He ends by describing futurism as having, quote, and this is a direct quote, at least assuming my translation was accurate, a lack of profundity, no sense of humanity, absence of construction, hermaphrodite feelings, homosexual plasticity,
Yeah.
fake historical interpretation,
Wow.
and false lyricism. False lyricism and homosexual plasticity. He's literally saying it's fake and gay. You want to talk how stuck our culture is? People calling these dipshit artists fake and gay is already 100 years old.
Wow. Never would have assumed that. This is fascinating.
He ends his essay with 3 Latin words, pictor classicus sum, I am a classical painter. So De Chirico is going to spend the rest of his life at least trying to do classical paintings, whether or not they're any good. And we will be talking about him very shortly when we start talking about the fascists. But just as an example, here is his pre-classical stuff. Here's his pre-war stuff. Again, you can kind of see the Freudian, dreamlike, airy quality to this.
Being the influence of automation.
Yeah, totally. Now, just interestingly enough, like I said, we live in the age of YouTube and the internet. For most of the 20th century, you could only really learn about this stuff in a classroom where a professor explained it to you. But now you can go on sites like WikiArt and look at the guy's entire catalog. And you can see that before 1919, a lot of his art was this weird modern style. And after 1919, he's absolutely trying to do stuff in a classical way. And jury's out on whether or not he was any good at it. But, he walked the talk. And when you listen to some museum docent saying, well, this artist, he went through this movement in the year 1926, you can always now pull out WikiArt on your phone and see if if the gallery curator is full of shit or not. The professoriate no longer has a monopoly on these things. More generally, though, De Chirico, he is describing something called the return to normalcy or the call to order, where at least some of the avant-garde is scaling things back, though by no means uniformly. Some of it is going to maintain the modern aesthetic, but they're going to be a lot more figurative as opposed to the purely abstract stuff that you saw before the war from like the futurists, the cubists, and the expressionists. Here's an example. Here's Picasso's 3 Women. Still not really realistic. If you look at these women's arms, they look like big cylinders.
It's like maybe ogresses.
Yeah, well, yeah, now I see it. Yeah, holy shit. But at least it did look like the full-on cubist stuff that you saw before the war.
Yeah, there's a return to normalcy a little bit here.
Here is Leger, the tubist who we showed a little earlier in this episode. This is still very clearly a modern aesthetic, but it's also not a bunch of factory pipes where you have to squint and think, okay, this kind of looks like soldiers playing cards.
I've got to again evoke Adult Swim.
Yeah, I can see that. This could be an episode of Archer,
or Angela Anaconda or something. Some weird show. I guess
I don't think I ever watched that.
That was more a kids show that
Okay.
got popular with certain enjoyers. It's about the adventures of an autistic girl and her overweight friend. we'll do riff tracks on it at some point. But.
Speaking of an idea that just gets completely wrung dry.
Yeah.
When we talk about Paris, we'll be talking about the Surrealists who view themselves as the successor movement to De Chirico's metaphysical paintings. But De Chirico just thinks the Surrealists are a bunch of degenerates, and to be honest, he's probably not wrong about that.
So it's like Saddam Hussein thinking he's the heir to Babylon. Maybe, the Babylonians might have different thoughts on that.
Yeah, De Chirico, he said he's going to throw away all of that pretentious stuff, and he's going to go whole hog into being a propagandist for Mussolini. And that brings us back to our good friends, the Futurists, led by Tommaso Marinetti, the writer of the 1909 Manifesto. I wasn't expecting the Futurists to be the star of our story, but we've had to talk about them considerably for the last 3 episodes. If I were to write a manifesto about how all art needs to be overthrown unless it uses only blue and orange, you would think I was crazy and probably pretentious.
We'd put you away.
Yeah, but in the rubble of World War I, after a bunch of Western financiers had, bankrolled a bunch of intellectuals to overthrow the Tsar in Russia, a guy with crazy ideas about art can make a name for himself if he makes friends with a guy with radical ideas about politics.
Opportunity.
Now, in the case of Italy, once the radicals established themselves, the propagandists were not quite going to meet the same fate that they did in Russia, but they were going to be swept under the rug.
Sorry, guys.
If there's one thing a dictator does not want, it's an artiste spreading crazy ideas. But in the first few years of the revolution, you are a major asset when you can find daring and creative ways to rail against the ancien regime in a way that resonates with the masses. And in 1915, there's a demonstration in Rome where Marinetti ends up getting arrested, and he makes friends with another guy who gets arrested at the same protest. Marinetti says this guy embodies the spirit of futurism, and his name is Benito Mussolini. By 1919, there are a bunch of these fascist futurist clubs opening up across Italy, and that year Marinetti gets elected to the Central Committee of the Italian Fascist Party. Mussolini had been a revolutionary Marxist until World War I, when for one reason or another he dropped Marxism and embraced fascism. I've heard differing theories about why that is, but I think the most plausible theory is that Mussolini realized the Italian people were going to be a much easier sell if you are preaching a nationalist ideology as opposed to an ideology that wants to eliminate national distinctions.
Yep.
Mussolini is not some sort of a Trotsky figure just nerding out on theory. When Mussolini becomes a fascist, there's not exactly a large body of fascist literature. In fact, some of the foundational texts of fascism, including Giovanni Gentili's philosophical underpinnings of fascism, they're written after Mussolini takes over. So they're making this shit up as they go along. Arguably, these futurist writings are quite influential in the development of fascism, but let's be clear about one thing. That's just an indication of how little political theory underlies fascism. It's not an indication of how prescient futurism is.
It's more what you do than what you believe, I think.
Yeah. Well, Mussolini, he is ambitious. He is just looking for post hoc justification. And there are these local political organizations of various political stripes called fasci, which is Italian for a bundle of sticks. So it's the other F word that is synonymous for a bundle of sticks. Fasci are symbolic of strength and being bound together. So when Mussolini takes over the Milanese fascio, history says he's influenced by the futurists, but really, what is futurism? A manifesto about Eurotrash staying up late, then speeding a car around the city and ending up in a ditch? Like, the one thing that is important about the Futurist Manifesto, though, is that it does talk about being proud of Italy as opposed to being stuck in the past. It says tradition is important, but you have to be willing to break from tradition. And the other important thing about the Futurist Manifesto is it says you need to be willing to start fights in the streets. Now,
This is coming back into vogue.
well, I know that in your former line of work, you had to deal with a lot of Eurotrash starting bar fights.
Yeah, every 4 years. It was a freaking Vietnam.
I'm not sure I am willing to start a bar fight really qualifies as an academic political theory.
No, I would agree with that. I would.
And let's also not forget that De Chirico just called them a bunch of hermaphrodites and homosexuals.
Yep.
So,
No getting around.
So in April 1919, Mussolini says that the first material achievement of the fascist revolution is when Marinetti raided the office of a communist newspaper. In October 1922, when the fascists organized the March on Rome and install Mussolini in a coup, the fascists are marching side by side with the black shirts. People sometimes say that fascism is a right-wing ideology. In reality, they just got the support of the businesses during the 3-year period between 1919 and 1922, and Mussolini just rolled with it. You know, because no sooner does America impose the peace settlement, selling it with the slogan, making the world safe for democracy, then the world is just overrun with all of these revolutionary movements. And the only difference is that when the communists are trying to be part of a worldwide revolution, the Italians just see fascism as our revolution. So, as I said before, we use the term totalitarian to refer to these post-World War I regimes. And totalitarianism means you need an official propaganda apparatus to keep the people on the same page. And the futurists really thought that the fascists were going to create this system that enshrined all of their ideas and would grant them special status. And thus futurist art was going to be the official art of Italy. In one of the last paragraphs of the Futurist Manifesto, they say, we're all in our 20s. We hope that by the time we're in our 40s, the next generation comes along and overthrows us. So, you know, they're very much a movement of the moment. Here's the thing, though. Barack Obama had this image of being this young, hip member of Generation Jones, the cool guy, cut and polished for the new media landscape of the 21st century.
It's like political Will Smith.
Yeah. Probably nothing has done more to hurt Obama's legacy than the fact that Donald Trump is 20 years older than him and probably more media savvy and more cool. Like it or not, I don't say that. I'm not saying whether I like Trump or not, but Trump is cooler than Obama is, and if you don't want to admit that fact, I'm sorry. This is exactly the same fate that's going to befall the futurists, because no sooner than Mussolini takes over than he says, you know what? Fascism is about reattaining Italy's greatness, both through military conquest and through culture, and that means leaning into the fact that Italy was the birthplace of the Renaissance.
Wow.
Womp womp.
Yeah.
So this brings our good friend De Chirico back into the picture, because by the end of the 20s, there's really only one of the OG futurists who still supports Marinetti. The original Futurist Manifesto talked about war as being hygiene, but when World War I broke out, that really changed the attitude about war. First of all, two of the original futurists, Umberto Boccioni and Antonio Sant'Elia, I butchered my Italian, but I also don't speak that language. The two of them, they both died in battle, so, you know, that also kind of changes the makeup of an avant-garde movement.
Well, little attrition.
This is Boccioni's first futurist painting. It's called The City Rises. Again, you see the...
Communist.
Well, I was just going to say you see the time. You see multiple moments in time overlaid in this painting. Here's another one of them called Simultaneous Visions, if you need to really be beaten over the head with the fact that multiple frames of time are being overlaid on the same painting.
It's like a hallucinogen trip.
Yep. So here are some of the architectural drawings of Sant'Elia, Antonio Sant'Elia. None of his buildings ever really got built, but you can kind of see the vision for a city like Los Angeles, what Los Angeles was building towards when the civil rights movement came in the 60s and very much changed the vision of American cities. Very much changed the makeup of places like Compton.
Yeah.
Also, later on, when you have movies like Blade Runner, you really see the influence of these drawings on the aesthetic of a movie like that.
Well, I was even going to say this. You can see Star Wars.
Yeah,
pretty
definitely.
clearly here, so.
Just like surrealism never went anywhere in our culture, futurism never went anywhere either. Again, first of all, these two guys were killed in battle. And second of all, another one of the OG futurists named Carlo Carrà, he had met De Chirico in a hospital during the war. This was a couple of years before that essay where De Chirico said, fuck modern art, nobody knows how to draw people anymore, I'm a classical painter now. But nevertheless, they both agree with each other that they're just tired of trying to prove a point. And Karras starts writing essays on people like Giotto, who we mentioned back in the first episode. He was the guy who stopped painting icons in the two-dimensional Byzantine style and figured out how to paint realistic faces. So again, the idea of the Futurists being the official art of Italy going forward, no, they're going to look straight back 600 years. So the Futurists helped Mussolini take over. Marinetti wanted to be the guy in charge of art, and Mussolini just said no. And this is something you'll see over and over again. These dictators, they all have wives and mistresses who demand to have a say in how things are run. And hubby decides, you know what, just take care of the arts. So again, avant-garde artists, you are never going to outplace a rich guy's wife who wants to be the art director of whatever project you want.
Yep.
Then as now, and I'm sure as always, Mussolini's mistress is no exception. Her name is Margherita Sarfatti, and she is going to support a new group of artists who are going to say, you know what, fuck this pretentious futurist stuff. We want a beautiful Renaissance-style art. And this group is going to be called the Novecento. The Quattrocento was the 1400s, which was the first part of the Renaissance. So the Novecento just means the 1900s. Like the Quattrocento is when you had Masaccio and Donatello, Brunelleschi, Botticelli. The Novecento is going to be the official art of Italian fascism. So they're going to get the role that the Futurists wanted. They don't want to completely get rid of the modern art, but they certainly want to make classical art popular again, make art great again. So once again, the narrative turns out to be bullshit about how in the 20s people were tired of art that didn't represent the existential questions of modernity. In reality, people were perfectly happy with the old stuff.
Okay.
And Mussolini, he gives a bunch of key posts to these Novecento artists, including De Chirico, saying that man needs order before he needs culture, which I would tend to agree with.
Yeah. It's Catholic Church. That's like out of their missionary manuals.
Yeah, well, it's Italy, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Now, avant-garde artists, they never seem to have a problem with hopping on board a new bandwagon every few years, so most of the former futurists just become Novecento artists and get on with their lives. Here are some examples. Here's De Chirico doing a self-portrait. You can still kind of see a little bit of the modern style, but this, you can clearly see this is leaning into the Renaissance style as well.
He looks like a snitch on The Sopranos.
Or just the muscle in every mob movie out of the early 90s.
Tony, I didn't do it.
Or the waiter at the mob-built Italian restaurant.
Yeah. Mob runner.
This is Lot's Daughters by Carlo Carrà. So you can still kind of see a little bit of the modern style here, but this is going right back to telling biblical stories in art again. It's one of the less graphic tellings of the story of Lot's Daughters, if you're not familiar with that one.
Blessed.
Here's Carlo Carra's estate. It's Renaissance style, but it's showing the common man. So it's not completely going back to the art of the 1400s. This is another one of De Chirico's paintings. It's called Gladiators in Repose. Again, he wants to be proudly Italian, and what's more proudly Italian than paintings of gladiators. But just look at those faces. He was still, I think, honing his craft.
Yeah, there's some lack of fluency here in terms of what I think he'd like to do.
It's an interesting case study, just looking at the propaganda of Mussolini, because there's a book called The Cult of the Duce a few years ago, which had a chapter on this. Mussolini's kind of like a Johnny Depp character. He can play a realistic person, or he can play a Tim Burton or a Terry Gilliam character within a weird theatrical setting, or he can do the Disney thing and play Jack Sparrow. But he's also always Johnny Depp. He never really loses himself in a role, even though he's a good actor. Mussolini, he can be in hyper-realistic portraits, or he can be in propaganda pictures that are very artistic and stylized, or he can be in almost historical paintings as well. And he can always seem to match his personality to it. There's a lot of paintings of Mussolini, and it's hard to pin down just what the prevailing style is when it comes to Mussolini propaganda. I leave it to you to decide if that means he's a Justin Trudeau type figure or not.
Are there any pictures of him in blackface?
Not that I know of. I also don't think he'd be afraid of it.
No, you don't.
Here's one illustration of him. It's clearly based on the silent films of the 1920s. Here's a bust. Here's a famous bust that was made out of him. It's clearly, an homage to old Roman busts, but it's also modern. There's no excess ornamentation on it either. This is a biography by a guy named Sarfati in 1926, showing that same bust in the previous slide, but it's shown at kind of a funny angle here. It's not quite profile, it's certainly not head on either, but it's really leaning into the Roman aesthetic.
Showing off an equine nose.
Yep. Here is La Prima Ondata, or the First Night, clearly reminiscent of Garibaldi. So maybe not going all the way back to Rome, but certainly going back to Italian history. Here is, interestingly enough, this is a commemorative plate showing him as St. George slaying the dragons. The caption says, San Giorgio Benito, or St. George Benito, slaughtering the dragon of sanctions. So the League of Nations had put sanctions on him for invading Ethiopia.
I promise you that Putin is making the Orthodox Church do something like this.
Yeah.
Right
I guarantee it. I mean, after Italy lost to Ethiopia in World War I, Mussolini just really needed to save face on that one.
Yeah, that would be a hard one to explain.
He did manage to beat the people with spears, but only when he could drop bombs from them from planes.
Yep. that level of freaking.
Here is a stylized, obviously modern sculpture, but this figure almost becomes synonymous with Mussolini.
Looks like Cipriano.
Yeah, I can see that as well. Here's a postcard from 1939, which is supposed to represent Mussolini as a boatman, which is an homage to that sculpture that was made. So even in the modern style, there's certainly modern propaganda about Mussolini, and everybody would recognize this as supposed to be symbolic of Mussolini. It's almost kind of the modern equivalent of somebody like Holbein presenting a portrait to Henry VIII at the royal court, because Mussolini loved this modern stuff as well.
Okay.
The abstract face certainly gets the masculinity across too. He's supposed to look like the guy helming the ship.
Got the good jawline.
Yeah, exactly. I'm not going to say there's no value in this modern stuff. I'm just going to say that it's not a substitute for the old stuff. Here is another abstract sculpture, and you can kind of see in profile on the two sides of it how this kind of looks like Mussolini. So go figure. He's a guy just with a face that just translates really well into paintings and sculpture, even something like this.
I notice in most tellings of history, they're very happy to show you pictures of like Hitler and Stalin because they're funny looking guys.
Yep.
But like with a handsome fascist, it's like.
Yep. Here's more straight up realistic propaganda. This is Balla's March on Rome. And again, Balla, he was a futurist as well, but when he needed to pay the bills doing things the old-fashioned way, he had no problem doing it. This was in 1932. This was supposed to be the 10th anniversary of the March on Rome. But the point I'm just trying to make is this is more what you think of when you think of propaganda, and Mussolini certainly had a face for that too. Here's some photographs of him. The one on the top left is him being a man of the people, of the workers, and the workers holding up their shovels. The one on the far right, it almost looks like a Hollywood headshot.
Yeah, seriously.
Like, this
Good
is something
eyes.
new in the 20s, but, a headshot that you send to a casting call, this looks like this picture of Mussolini in the 20s.
It looks these very like
people like with like Vince McMahon, very animated features.
Yep.
You know, very these big eyes, these large eyebrows in many cases. It just really communicates emotion, and that's something that's important to propaganda for whatever reason.
And also in true Putin style, he's got one picture of him topless.
Yeah, from the one angle where he's not going to look like a fat old man.
I again pose the question to you, does this mean he is a talented propagandist, or does this mean he's Justin Trudeau?
Good point. Camera loved that kid.
Here's more of a traditional military portrait of him, and this is right as he's deciding to invade Ethiopia. So again, he's got a face for this too. I'm not going to say he doesn't. Like I said, he's a Johnny Depp figure. He's a guy who can play Hunter S. Thompson. He can play Edward Scissorhands. He can play Jack Sparrow, or he can play a serious character. And here's how well it worked in Ethiopia. He got all the locals of Ethiopia to start saluting another stylized picture of him, which also, he's got the face for the kind of propaganda that resonates in Ethiopia.
Yeah, and he does. Give me your coffee, you jerks.
Here is a sculpture at a stadium in, I think this was in Milan. I can't remember which city this was in. But you said historians don't want to allow the photogenic image of Mussolini. Yeah, they made sure to destroy this after the war. There's very few photographs of this sculpture, and it was iconic in its day. Another thing you see in fascist Italy is the cult of urban planning. That's one of the things they claim to, be the central to the fascist project is urban revitalization and doing new things with the Italian cities. And one thing you get out of it is a lot of these murals.
Okay.
This is called the Apotheosis of Fascism. It's a mural in Rome from the 30s. Obviously, you see the Duce in the middle, but he is flanked by scenes from throughout Italian history, going right back to the Roman Empire. And another mural you'll see is this one. This is called Italy Among the Arts and the Sciences. Again, trying to say that fascism is going to be the ideology, and Mussolini is going to be the man that leads Italy into the future, and this is the latest in a long string that goes right back to the Roman Empire.
That false continuity again.
Yep. When an empire falls, the joke is they went from being Romans to being Italians. The other joke is that what was the Romans' punishment for their decadence in the last few years of the empire?
Oh,
They became Italians.
yeah, pretty good.
Now, Mussolini is not Stalin. He has rhetoric about controlling everything, and his famous slogan is "Tutto nello Stato, niente al di fuori dello Stato, nulla contro lo Stato." I hope I did that somewhat respectively. It translates to everything within the state, nothing outside the state, nothing against the state. But in reality, this is not Russia, where they're trying to wipe everything away and start from scratch. There are not going to be purges for ideological impurity. In fact, contrary to popular belief, Mussolini didn't even kill that many people. He didn't even have the death penalty until there was a failed attempt on his life. Mussolini is not Stalin, but he's also not Hitler. In fact, Hitler thinks Mussolini is a cultural troglodyte. Unlike Hitler, Mussolini is not some failed painter with autistic ideas about art and culture, so he's just not going to be as insistent as Uncle Adolf is about making sure that the pendulum swings a certain way. You get status in fascist Italy by getting state commissions, and that means you're going to be painting in a classical Novecento style. But you're still free to make whatever art you want on the side and sell it in your own independent exhibitions. You're not ending up in the concentration camp for making degenerate art. If you try to do weird experimental shit for the masses, Mussolini just didn't care that much.
He was too busy getting the trains to run on time.
Yeah, like, again, his attitude was, if you want to make art that looks like shit and you can find some businessman in Milan or Rome to buy it, God bless. Good for you, buddy. You're just not getting any state commissions for doing it. You've got an artist like this. This is Achille Fune. He is one classic example of this. He is making art that kind of looks both old and modern at the same time. This is just a painting of his sister. It clearly looks like a Renaissance painting, but she's wearing modern clothing. This is a guy who wants the state commissions, so he still does a little bit of modern stuff on the side, but he knows what side the bread is buttered on, and if he wants proper state commissions, you've got to deliver the goods at some point, and he's going to be delivering the goods. Here is another one of Fune's images called the Goddess Rome. So again, this is a modern take on a classical style. Sorry, I couldn't find an image without a watermark for this one. But
fuck you, Bridgman Images.
Yeah, well, so you just Roman mythology, but modern architecture behind it. Well, not even necessarily just modern architecture, just architecture from throughout history, including Roman stuff, including modern stuff, I should say. As for the Futurists, they wanted to be the head propagandists for Mussolini, and they got shuffled aside. But they're still around. Like I said, this is not Russia. They're not going to get sent to the Gulag. They're still around, and they're going to last until the 1940s when Marinetti dies, and the Futurist vision dies with him. But they adapt. In 1929, Marinetti invents something called aero painting, which is supposed to be art from the view of a cockpit. And this is actually kind of cool.
Yeah. Something reminiscent of a video game.
Well, at least it's something new. At least it's something different. For as much as I'm ripping on modern artists for not coming up with anything new and different, I will say it had to take something weird like paint the view from a cockpit, but this is something new and different, and I will definitely give the Futurists credit for this one.
Hitler will be putting cameras on planes for sure for some of his propaganda later. So
here's another one. This is
it's called 9/11.
It's supposed to be going down to the ground, but yeah, now that you've said that, I can't see it either. History's history.
Yeah, nothing you can do.
I guess nothing is new under the sun, including 9/11. Here's a couple of other Futurist paintings. There's one showing a skydiver. There's one showing the farmland in the countryside. The one in the top right almost combines the aero painting and the original Futurist motion lines.
Yeah.
So, this was in vogue for a couple of years and, went out of style. I have some respect for this.
Yeah.
I don't have respect for the artists who want to keep rehashing the urinal over and over again.
Yeah. It's like a cargo cult.
It's exactly what it is. And of course, because Mussolini lends himself to all sorts of propaganda, you have Mussolini propaganda in the aero painting style as well.
Well, why does this remind me of Marvel? This looks like one of the Eternals coming up out of the ground or something.
Yeah. Well, probably because Marvel was an homage to this.
Yeah, exactly.
Like, the Futurists come up with an idea for painting from a cockpit, and Mussolini still makes good. He still has a face for that kind of propaganda as well.
He looks like Buddy from Watchmen.
Yeah, I can see that too.
Yeah.
Or Arnold Schwarzenegger's Mr. Freeze.
Yeah.
So, the real contribution of the Futurists during the reign of Mussolini, though, it's the photo montage propaganda poster. That's the one thing that they do well. We will see the photo montage in the Russian avant-garde, and when we look at the Dadaists. You'll even see it in the 60s with like Monty Python and Terry Gilliam's cartoons. But you could make the argument that the Futurists perfected the art of stylized propaganda. This is a a photo montage by Ivo Panagi called The Berlin Stock Market. A bunch of cutouts from the newspaper, which it's not just something you did in arts and crafts class in the 90s. This was new and interesting back then when newspapers could be mass produced.
Mm-hmm.
This was original back then. This is the style of the futurist photo montage.
I'm reminded of like zines from the 60s and 90s.
Yeah. Well, like you said, it's clearly what inspired Monty Python.
Yep.
But as I said, they perfected the art of the propagandist photo montage. A picture of Mussolini from the newspaper with the dots on it, combined with a bunch of pictures of crowds. I don't know, it kind of works.
It's effective propaganda.
Yeah. Even the photo montage, even the collage, Mussolini just had a face for it. You know, I am like the least photogenic person alive. This guy looked good in a painting that was supposed to be a stylized, like, view from a cockpit.
The camera loved him, the paintbrush loved him. His people eventually did not love him. Spoilers.
But just to be clear, this was not the norm for propaganda. The masses are simple creatures. They like a big painting with a simple message, and they preferred all of the other propaganda of Mussolini looking like a Hollywood headshot or wearing a military regalia, all that stuff. They don't care about this cerebral stuff. The thing, though, that the futurists did prove was that you can be a total shill for the system but still be cool and irreverent. And we had best remember that, because we're kind of living in a time of massive realignment in the political, technological, and creative worlds in 2025.
Yep.
You know, being against the system because you hate your dad, sure, it had cultural cachet in the 1960s and 1970s. The cool guys in fascist Italy were total shills for Mussolini, and I think their art was better for it.
Well, you'd argue even today, right? Like, you know, Joe Rogan is certainly friends with Trump. And,
Mm-hmm.
you know, I know all of a sudden he's not trashing Elon the way he used to. It's like...
Everything in this world is done by a small committee of people when you get high enough.
Yep.
Marinetti died in 1944, and somewhat fittingly, he was working on propaganda war poems when he had a heart attack. But 2 years earlier, at the age of 65, he had volunteered for the war effort. He originally volunteered for the invasion of Ethiopia, but he ended up seeing active service in Russia. And
what a lucky guy.
Here's a picture of him.
Wow.
That's a hard-looking 65.
Yeah, seriously. If you said 85, I'd have been like, yeah.
That's Marinetti. He died in 1944, and futurism went with him. But you know, if you watch The Jetsons or Star Trek or The Fifth Element, you still see the idea of finding beauty and wonder in technology. And you still see the idea that no tradition is so sacred that it can't be thrown out or at least poked at a bit. We also talked last time about how the most cliched scene in all of Hollywood, the car chase, is straight out of Marinetti's manifesto. And by the 80s, you do start to see a little bit of an inversion in movies like RoboCop and Blade Runner, where futurism is now starting to be seen as something that robs us of our humanity. But it's hard to say that these ideas ever left our culture, when for every dystopian movie like Demolition Man, you also had a movie like The Fifth Element that portrayed the concrete mechanized future optimistically.
Absolutely.
So I leave it to you to decide whether that means Marinetti was a visionary or whether it means that our culture has just stagnated.
I just want to say that Mussolini would come to regret his face being such an icon, because when he was trying to escape to Switzerland with an eye patch on, he was recognized and put to a brutal end by his own subjects.
And that picture of him being put to a brutal end is just as iconic as all the other ones.
Yep.
So, like I said, that's the first of our Rashomon flashbacks. In the next episode, we are going to be looking at Russia, we are going to be looking at Berlin, and we're going to be looking at Paris. That's where things get a little bit more complicated. But that's where, as I said, we're going to see things like the pointless art installation. We're going to see where that comes from. So it's a little bit of a spoiler and a tease for next time. So thanks for listening, guys.
All right, you know the drill. Like and subscribe on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. Support us at kofi.com/Radio Free History or at subscribestar.com/radio-free-history.